Let's begin our meeting today with the materials. In front of us, we have excerpts from Jerzy Melibruda's work, specifically the fourth part of the 7 paths of psychotherapy integration.
That's right.
We'll focus on what actually happens in therapy after the diagnosis. What does the process of change look like? How do we work on patterns that don't serve us?
Exactly. We want to understand what these personal schemas are that Melibruda writes about.
And how they can, be modified.
Exactly. Melibruda shows that therapy isn't just about figuring out what's wrong. Above all, it's active work.
Work on change.
Yes. We'll see how he defines these schemas and why he believes that weakening those old destructive patterns is crucial.
But also,
At the same time, building new competencies, simply to cope better with life, with emotions, with relationships.
okay, let's dive deeper into this. Melibruda talks about negative personal schemas. What exactly is that? It sounds pretty, serious.
You can imagine it as, deeply rooted patterns. They are repetitive and actually cover 3 dimensions that work together, a bit like a feedback loop.
3 dimensions, right? First of all,
Thoughts and beliefs about yourself, about others, about the world. That's the cognitive dimension.
okay,
And this dimension often triggers very specific, intense emotional reactions. Fear, shame, anger.
so emotions, the emotional dimension.
Exactly. And these emotions in turn push us towards certain behaviors, towards specific strategies in relationships, like avoidance, submission, or even attack.
So the behavioral dimension, action,
Yes. And all of this creates a repetitive cycle, a kind of loop. The author gives examples of these schemas, for instance. I have to be perfect, or if I trust someone, they will definitely hurt me, or I can't handle things on my own. These are typical core beliefs.
There's also the story of Barbara, a woman who kept ending up with the wrong partners, until it turned out that she was unconsciously driven by a schema like closeness equals getting hurt.
And how did that work?
Exactly. Her belief, that is the cognitive level, generated fear and emotions, and that made her subtly push away men who showed interest in her, in other words, her behavior.
So she was unconsciously sabotaging her chances for a good relationship.
Yes, this shows how these schemas can guide our lives. A bit from the backseat, right?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is the process of uncovering these mechanisms in therapy. The therapist helps the patient see this repetition, these loops of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors.
You probably look for the sources in childhood, right?
Often, yes. You look for roots, experiences, relationships with important people. But what's important is understanding how this schema operates now, in the person's current life.
Aha, so not just the past? Not only that, you actually analyze these 3 elements. What do I think about myself in difficult situations? What are my views on relationships? What emotions dominate them? And what are my typical reactions? Submission, avoidance. And this brings us to the heart of the matter. How do you change these schemas? Because that's what struck me about Melibruda. That it's not about fighting them by force or trying to erase them. That's probably impossible.
It's rather impossible, and I don't think that's even the point. He talks more about weakening old neural connections and building new ones.
Sort of like, instead of trying to fill in the old rut in the road, you just tread out a new, more comfortable path beside it.
Yes, that's a great metaphor, and there are concrete strategies for doing that. First, self-observation, which means learning to notice when that pattern even gets activated.
To catch that moment.
Exactly. Second, building something that Melibruda calls an internal observation, pointer conscious self, that can step aside for a moment and see what's happening. Oh, I'm falling into that pattern again, and that gives you a choice.
It creates space to choose a different reaction.
And so-called corrective experiences are also very important.
Corrective experiences? Sounds like some kind of self-experimentation.
In a way, yes, but in safe conditions often planned together with a therapist. The idea is to consciously try to behave differently than the pattern dictates.
And see what happens.
Exactly. And check whether the catastrophe we were afraid of actually occurs. That Barbara from the example could try not to withdraw immediately when her partner shows her affection.
And discover that maybe it doesn't lead to rejection.
Exactly. That things can be different. Cognitive techniques also help, of course, meaning actively challenging those automatic, negative thoughts and looking for evidence that they are not 100% true reflections of reality.
But listening to this, I get the impression That it's not just about analyzing and fixing old problems. I think Melibruda really emphasizes something more.
Yes, definitely. Because weakening old patterns is just one side of the coin. But for change to be truly lasting, we also need to build something new in their place.
And that's where these skills come in.
Exactly, specific skills, competencies. Melibruda divides them into two groups. Intrapersonal, meaning those related to contact with oneself.
For example,
better understanding of one's own emotions, needs, setting boundaries, self-awareness. And the second group is interpersonal.
so related to other people.
Yes. Effective communication, assertiveness, constructive conflict resolution. And these skills are simply learned. They are practiced during sessions, through homework assignments, sometimes through simulations.
So to sum it up, therapy according to Melibruda isn't just passively sitting and talking about the past. It's real concrete work on yourself, right?
Exactly.
On the one hand, we understand where our automatisms and patterns come from, and on the other, we actively learn new ways of being with ourselves and with others.
Yes, understanding where something comes from gives you motivation and direction, and new skills provide the tools to actually take a different path. This combination seems to be the key to lasting change.
Awareness, observation.
Yes, awareness, observation, experimenting with new behaviors, and systematic skills training.
So from these fragments, a picture emerges of therapy as a process that does indeed require commitment, but provides real tools for change. It's not just about diagnosing the problem, but also about learning how to solve it.
Which leads to an interesting question, I think, that's worth asking ourselves at the end. Since these patterns often operate automatically, they shape our reactions before we even have a chance to think about it.
That's true.
So in what kinds of everyday, seemingly ordinary situations, maybe even completely outside the context of Therapido, we ourselves unconsciously reinforce these old patterns? And where might there be, perhaps unnoticed, an opportunity to weaken them, to try something new?